Hi, and welcome to CTO Lifeline, the live stream dedicated to supporting CTOs and other technology leaders to realize their organization's aspirations. And today's topic, getting support for technical improvement. Now I'm going to throw to my co-host, who is at an undisclosed or soon-to-be disclosed location, Noah Cantor, to give you a little bit about his background.
Hi, everybody. I'm Noah. I'm a tech leadership coach. I have 20 years of experience working in technology, and I am currently at a tire shop. I was driving around just before the show started, and my tire blew out, and I'm now having it repaired. The irony of all of this is that we're doing a talk about investing in technical improvement, and I knew I needed new tires, and I put it off just one day too long, and now I'm dealing with an emergency. So we'll keep that in mind over the course of the show.
Yeah, I likened it to, it's all, when you lose a tire, it's almost like you lost, one of the hosts on the cluster, but then you realize that the cluster was dependent on that particular host. The car is out of action. And I am Daniel Walters, so I'm also a CTO coach, and I was the ex-CTO and CIO for Seek Asia. Now, before we get into today's topic, we've got a little bit of housekeeping. So firstly, we accept questions throughout the entire live stream. So if you've got questions, feel free to ask them at any point in time, and we'll do our best to incorporate that into what we cover today. It is also, it's not our inaugural one, but it is our second episode, and we're still in that test and learn phase. So there is slightly more branding. There was a little video start. Some of these technical things may work really smoothly for us. Some of it may go a bit hinky. We'll see how we go. We're learning. We're also keen to hear your feedback. Any other housekeeping, Noah, that we need to cover?
I think probably that we're just asked for grace while we get this figured out.
All right, so let's jump into today's topic. So last episode, we had a question in the chat that we didn't get to, but we thought was deserving of a full episode. So Ilya asked us, he said he would love to hear more thoughts in the future on how to present technical debt in terms of business value to key stakeholders. And so we've interpreted that question as part of the broader topic of getting support for technical improvement, which is, I know as a coach, and also when I was CTO for various companies, that was a constant challenge and a skill that I needed to invest time in to get better at. And so I'm keen to share what I've learned across the journey. Noah, your thoughts on this topic?
So I've had a fair amount of similar challenges trying to get tech debt addressed, whether it was as kind of a tech leader talking to executives or a consultant trying to get tech leaders who didn't quite understand the severity of the debt to actually embrace it and understand it and tackle it. So it's an issue that's near and dear to my heart, actually.
Excellent. And what's your experience dealing with technical debt?
So it's never easy. I think it's not something that has an obvious solution, and in many ways it seems to have obvious causes. Technical debt is often discussed as an approach as a technical problem, as something that, in fact, the very name implies that it's a technical problem. And it was defined in terms of technology being a technology issue when it was first articulated. But my experience is that it doesn't come from technology most of the time. Most of the time, it's a systemic issue. It's when you end up with technical debt in the system, it's because the debt shows up in technology, but that doesn't mean it belongs there. Like, that doesn't mean that it was created there. Yes, we make technology can take shortcuts. Technology can not have the skills to actually do a lot of the work. But almost all of that, when you look at it, gets traced back to policies that are created by the executive, by the leadership, that then have unintended consequences. For example, pressure to deliver often results in corners being cut. It results in things not being tested properly. It results in not having the right staff in the right place at the right time. A focus on utilization, keeping people busy, means that the people who are critical for making progress and making good decisions are often not available when a decision has to be made. The decision gets made anyway because it has to happen. But to then lay the results of that decision solely at the feet of technology seems disingenuous to me. It seems to be looking for a place to lay blame rather than fix the underlying issue, which is almost always something that originates outside technology, and technology people have very little control over it in the end. And so I like to think about it more as organizational debt, or I've heard it referred to as systemic debt. I've talked about it in terms of it being an organizational mortgage. So you take out a loan against the assets that you have, and it accrues interest over time. And if you don't pay it back, then there are prices to pay later, much like the flat tire that I'm dealing with right now.
Yes, one of the things that I've often talked to teams and clients about is the concept of paying as you go. So for that to work, it needs to be clear that the development team is responsible not only for the development, but also the enduring quality of the service as well. And if that's unclear, then that can lead to a disconnect between development, so developing features, and supporting the ongoing quality of the service. All right. So speaking of our live demonstration, Noah is about to be mobile. We're going to test the quality of the network. I won't ask you to mention the mobile provider, but this is pretty. We've only had one little brief outage. This is a pretty good advertisement for good connectivity. We'll see if it remains that way. Another way that I approach this issue is from the perspective of the customer experience. So, as Noah was talking about, the investments or push upstream that leads to, corners being cut or lack of investment or maintenance in certain areas can lead to effects on the customer experience. And so I like to look at, well, where are we falling short from the customer experience? That's number one. And number two, what risks are we aware of? So, a good example of that might be we've got a risk of, a large cost coming onto the business, a risk being realized that impacts us. And so those are two ways that, rather than thinking just about technical debt, we might reframe how we approach technical debt. So Noah, you're mobile. I'm hoping that you can still hear us. We seem to still have a good connection. How are you doing?
We're doing all right so far. It is, as you said, going to be an interesting experiment in connectivity. Maybe we will seek sponsorship from, say, One or Skinny or someone else who's we can advertise down having this conversation.
Excellent. Yeah. Always been a 2 degrees man myself. So if you're saying that technical debt doesn't adequately capture the problem, what does? What can how can people think differently about technical debt?
So if we think about it as something that has systemic causes rather than local causes, and when I say systemic, I mean the entire organization contributes to it, then we can start thinking about solutions in terms of what can the entire organization do to help prevent it, ideally. It's obviously much easier to prevent a problem than to actually fix it after it happens. And so when we think about the way that we ask people to do work, we ask people to, say, do 4 or 5 things at once. The amount of energy that they have to dedicate to any one of them is not going to be nearly as high and is likely to lead to compromises and problems. And so we think about how we ask people to do work, what work we ask them to do, how we think about kind of projects and work. It's a good starting point. And actually, there's one of the things that I think actually we'll come to that later. It's not actually relevant in the moment. I'm just kind of babbling at the moment. But no, I think that's a good start. So what about you? Where's your head at?
So I'm gonna bring something up on the screen, which I always felt was an impactful or influential artifact that sort of shifted my thinking on this. So I'm just so there was a post going a few years back from John Cutler, and he had sort of different framings for what approaches to work would look like. So there's a lot of things that can feel like they're faster, such as like putting work in parallel, filling up time boxes, which is as you referred, Noah, utilization, more work in progress, which you also referred to, getting ahead of the work, like, so having the design team or other teams sort of work in a silo to sort of fill up the backlog, and then sort of throw it over the fence to the next team to work it out. And then on the right side of this diagram, he had some concepts of like, well, better than starting work is finishing work. Having better than having no slack is having more slack. Better than parallelizing work is serializing work. So for me, there can be a shift of like what we intuitively feel might help us move as quickly as possible versus what actually might help us move as quickly as possible. And so when we're talking about the upstream effects of things that can contribute to technical debt and an overall slowing down and decline of quality, these can be some factors. Thoughts on this framing, Noah?
So I've seen this before, and I really like it. And it reminds me of something that I just read the other day. A mention of utilization. I was thinking about, in a lot of the time, it seems like the obvious thing to do is just to keep people busy. But it was really well described, I thought, by someone who was talking about hiring people to play a musical piece as part of an orchestra, right? And then the notion that I'm paying these people to work, so they should be playing all the time, every one of them. That's obviously more efficient. If I get the violinist to play 100% of the time and the percussionist to play 100% of the time and the wind instruments to play 100% of the time, that's efficient, right? But that doesn't get you the musical piece you're looking for, right? That's done by cooperation, interdependency, working together, all doing kind of the right thing at the right time. And that's a distinct difference. And if you were a conductor and you came up and you said, I want everyone playing all the time, you'd be fired. So why is it that in a very similar sort of work where we are all dependent on each other, we consistently believe that just being busy is the solution?
Great point. So let's shift tack a bit. We've sort of framed technical improvement, technical debt, but central to Ilya's question was, how do we bring this and reach alignment with key stakeholders across an organization? That's important not only to get support for investments, but it's also important because if we're taking to Noah's point that there is a systemic cause for technical debt and the customer experience issues that we're describing, then a successful partnership with your stakeholders across the organization, that is like everyone being in the same boat, is critical. So Noah, what are some of your strategies for engaging with the stakeholders across the organization?
If you could start answering that. I actually just got home and I'm now transferring inside, and come back to me in just about a minute or two. That'd be really helpful.
All right. Okay. And you're okay with that being in the background, or do you want me to take you off the stage for a brief while?
No, I'm good.
Okay, excellent. So let me talk about some of my recent experience. So I'm a CTO coach. I'm working with quite a number of CTOs, working in organizations in different sectors, of different company sizes, and some version of this challenge is being faced by all of them. And so one of the things I talk about is, if we start with the customer experience and we know the effects of how we're investing, if we know the linkages between what work we're doing and how it is translating to either customer experience issues or delivery issues, then we can actually start having proactive conversations with stakeholders. What I mean by proactive is, rather than trying to explain the issue or garner support at the time the issue is happening, actually getting out in front of it and talking about, here are the risks we're aware of, here's the issues, here's what we think it could lead to. It is a much better starting point for credibility. It shows that you're understanding the situation of the technology and services that you're responsible for, and it enables you to actually start building up a common language with your stakeholders about how you all think about the issue. So we will come and do a bit more of a deeper dive later in the chat around communication. I can just see a couple of comments in the chat, so I might call those out whilst I'm waiting for Noah to come back online. So Richard Paris says, I like the orchestra analogy. So yeah, and we presented about utilization and that we present around utilization and busy work. Mark Simpson says, no one feels obliged to watch Netflix 24 hours a day to get the maximum utilization from their $20.99 a month. Yeah, exactly right. So just all right.
All right, I'm
Is
back.
this we got you on your desktop? Excellent.
Yeah, I appreciate the patience.
Now, just a reminder, if you've got any questions or want us to go deeper into particular areas, we will answer and incorporate any of your questions directly into our discussion. So yeah, Noah, I'm not sure if you caught it, but I was just talking about some of the framing and the value of having a proactive approach to communicating with stakeholders. So if I knew that to understand some of the challenges, there were some core concepts stakeholders across the business might need to know, then starting with a communication plan around that is something that I've often done. So, for instance, maybe there's maybe we're running an e-commerce portal and there's a whole different sections of the flow to get a payment transacted successfully and to do that with the lowest risk possible. Well, education around what those steps are, what the risks are at each step, and the sorts of investments we may need to address those is the sort of picture that you want to paint using very accessible and hopefully less technical language. That is, show it from the perspective of the impact to the organization, not just how you get the work done.
Yeah, and it's the more you can kind of frame things up front, the more effective you can often be. And one of the ways that I've seen that done is it's not the ideal situation, but disaster prediction. So I worked with a CTO not long ago who, when they got started, their job found that the site was a mess and development practices hadn't been maintained, and it had led to significant risks, both on the performance side and on the maintenance and just uptime side. And one of the first things they did was put together a report that said, this is where we're carrying risk. These are the things that are likely to happen if we don't deal with them. And these are the problems that I would expect us to have based on what I understand today. And what that did was it meant that when those things then happened, they didn't come across as reactive. They came across as having understood what the context of the problem was and talked about ways to possibly prevent them, but actually set the rest of the executive up to understand what was happening and why it was problematic, as well as by predicting the problems in advance. It meant that they didn't sound like they were just complaining when things went wrong. It sounded like, if we invest in these areas, we can stop these things happening again. And just by being there first, it creates quite a lot of credibility if things actually do go wrong in the way that you've predicted they do, or they will.
Excellent. All right. Well, we've got a couple more comments here, and I've just realized I can bring them up on the screen. So let's try that. 3-Day Benkai says, interested on your perspective on the CTO's role in providing enabling constraints within which to work. So you're nodding, Noah. So I'm going to throw to you.
I like this. I like this question. I worked in an organization a number of years ago, back in 2008, and we had very, very few rules about how technology had to be tackled. And we provided maximum autonomy to software developers to figure out the best ways to do things. But we did have some enabling constraints. For example, at the time, the company's choice was Ruby unless something else is clearly a better choice. And so we didn't have developers running off trying every new thing under the sun. We had a default setup that said, use Ruby for software development unless you clearly have something else that will work better. We also had another constraint, which was you can do anything you want in any language you want, but you can't release it to production unless other people know how it works and can provide support for it. And when you combine those two things, we had some really interesting behavior. One of my favorites was one weekend, not long after Node started getting popular, probably around 2009, 2010. One weekend, one of our software developers said to themselves, Ruby it's great and we love working with it, but actually for this application over here, what we need is maximum response times. And we were dealing with hundreds of thousands of requests per second. So Ruby was really straining. He said, I wonder if Node would actually be a better solution for dealing with this. And so over the weekend, he replaced the core functionality of the system with Node. He came back in on Monday and he said, I just did this thing. It was a lot of fun. It's better than what we have. You guys should all do it. And then he sat down and he taught the rest of his team how to work in Node. And essentially, because of the work that he did over the weekend and the constraints we had and the problem we had, the entire team shifted their work on that particular project to be working in Node. And it essentially, we were working in the cloud at the time. It essentially dropped our bill in AWS by about 30% because we needed significantly fewer servers in order to perform the same functionality. And the whole team got to play with the new technology they'd all wanted to, but hadn't been able to justify. And so just thinking about that in terms of what's good for the business, what's good for people, what's going to allow people to try things and grow and develop without putting artificial constraints on them. And I think that was a really fun example of actually seeing enabling constraints in action. And I've kind of aspired to achieve similar things in other places I've worked, but that's still my favorite story about it. And it's been like 15 years, I think, since it happened. What about you, Danny? Have you got some experiences?
I've got examples which I've seen which don't work in my experience. So one pattern that I've seen is as the language of technical debt starts to take root in the organization, the response to it might be putting an allocation. It's like, hey, every week or every fortnight, we're going to do 15% of time for paying down technical debt, which sounds brilliant. Like, hey, we've named it, we've identified it, we weren't dealing with it earlier. And so now there's this very generous allocation of 15% to work on it. But having worked with many teams and in organizations where I was responsible for 20 plus teams, that approach, while well-intentioned, has rarely, if ever, worked. Like it can start positively. Hey, we knocked off a little bit of the technical debt. But the reality is the amount of technical debt that you have to solve may justify 5% of your time or 100% of your time. It really depends on the context of like, what's the effect of that? There's been times when the risks in an organization and their management of systems were getting so great that we stopped the line. That was no new feature development. Now this is a good lever for CTOs when the situation justifies it, because it signals that there are serious risks, and we're thinking very seriously about it. And sometimes that investment to get back to healthy, so that you have the right to start adding new value, the risk to present value has been reduced enough. So that's an example of that may have been intended as an enabling constraint, but the reality is it's not a great approach to to addressing technical debt?
I like the framing. So if you're going to use the term technical debt, the framing that Mick Kirsten uses in Project to Product, I find really helpful. He talks about technical debt is the stuff that gets in the way of being able to deliver value. Technical debt isn't everything that's had a subpar implementation. It's not the stuff that's now out of date. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that could potentially be technical debt, but if you frame it in terms of what the stuff that gets in the way of delivering value, then it becomes much easier to then justify resolving it, becomes easier to actually focus on it and tackle it at the time that you're actually trying to deliver that value, because it means that some things may never get touched because actually they work fine the way they are. They're generating revenue, or they're at least not a net negative on the organization, but they're not kind of strategically in the way of you doing what you want to do. And so is it really necessary to tackle them? For some people, they'd say yes, but I think a lot of the time the answer is no. And just psychologically being able to let go of the things that don't matter that much is really valuable, because it weighs on us when we think about all the possible things in our system, in our technical systems, that could be better than they are. That's more than we're likely to ever be able to tackle. But if we just focus on the stuff that allows us to do our work better and deliver more value, that's a much, much narrower focus. It's much more easier. It's much easier to then think about and deal with.
Excellent. I've got a couple more comments here. So I'm just going to put them on screen. This one's from Jeff Gilberto. Shifting tech debt from being a technology concern is important. I like how Noah referred to it as org debt. It should be just another item in a backlog with enough detail to prioritize and measure.
So I see that. The last part of that sentence is one that the last sentence is one that I sometimes struggle with, and that I like tackling technical debt as part of other work that delivers value. It's not something that exists separately from the rest of the organization or the rest of the tech stack or the rest of our systems. It is built into the work that we're doing, and addressing it as we go, as you said, is really important. And one of the things that I think helps make that really clear is years ago, Kent Beck defined the stages of code completeness, right? And it's not universal, but it's a really good example. And stage one is, does it work? And I know plenty of organizations that stop even before they get to stage one. So I can understand why you would want to articulate it. But it's only the first of 4 levels. The second level is does it communicate? Which means, is it readable? Is it maintainable? 6 months from now, when I come back and look at it, am I going to know what I'm doing? The third one is no duplicate code. And we know from kind of microservice architecture approaches and other things that have changed in the meantime that there are limits to the value of don't repeat yourself. But as a concept, it's worth kind of understanding and thinking about in terms of what you're writing. And then the fourth level is the fewest numbers of methods and classes. So it should be as simple as possible, but not simpler, right? And if you can get to stage 4, then the level of technical debt that you're leaving behind for the future is very little. But if you stop after the first stage of does it work, you're essentially creating future work for yourself. You're creating a problem for you tomorrow that doesn't have to be there. And future you hates present you for doing that. It thinks you probably could have done better.
Just like future me, well, present me wish that I did a little bit more exercise over the last 4 weeks, because I've got a basketball game coming up. So along this same track, and look, let me just call out that there may be people on the stream that are coming, like represent different organizations at different levels of evolution. And by evolution, like you might be working for a startup and you're still trying to find your product market fit. So some of the things that we're talking about may be sensible, but how far you apply it may differ. So for instance, you might be testing something quickly out and able to wear more technical debt or more risk than after you've got, you've validated product market fit and are starting to scale up. But one of the things I found that was very useful in more established organizations where they had products out in the marketplace was working with teams that owned each service and being clear and explicit about what does that service running well look like? What does it look like from a performance point of view? What does it look like from an availability point of view? What are the key jobs to be done? What is the security standards that we're complying with? What is the, across all those different risk dimensions, what is appetite? What does healthy look like and what does unhealthy look like? And so this framing can be very helpful because it can be communicated to stakeholders in a way that they understand. They understand how they consume. They understand good might look like that way. And so to Jeff and Noah's point around connecting to value on the backlog, you start with that framing. So we're making this investment so that we can keep that sub-second page time, or so that we maintain our 4 nines availability, or so that we are compliant to the, what the risk commitments are, like the cybersecurity risk commitments are, et cetera, et cetera. So that framing both can be a connecting between the development team and the stakeholders. And it's also why I'm pretty conflicted with Mick Kirsten's book. It's a great book. It's got so much good content, but it only had 1.5 pages on value. And that's my criticism of an otherwise very good book. We have one other comment here. I'll pull that up whilst you're talking, Noah.
Well, I'm working with a startup at the moment, and it was started by 2 non-technical founders, and they didn't have any money and they didn't have any tech knowledge. And so they reached out to their community, which didn't involve any technologists. And they said, do any of you know developers who are interested in working on a startup project? And so they got somebody involved, and they went out and they got a number of junior developers from a university to help them kind of build the first version of the product. And when I first met them, those decisions had been made and they were kind of on their way. And I sat down with them and I said, this is fine. If you don't have any money and you want to get to this point, this is fine, but you should be aware that you are likely to have to throw away everything that they write, because they'll do their best. And there's nothing wrong with the work that they're doing if you understand the level that they're at. But as a non-technical founder, they have no way to assess the capabilities of the people that they bring on board. They have no way to figure out whether or not the people that they are trusting to do technology work are actually capable of doing good technology work. And so I think it makes a really good illustration of kind of the technical debt that gets created by business decisions, even if the debt then shows up in the technology space. Right? They're great guys. They're really smart. They're really thoughtful, but they don't have the expertise to do this work. And so they need some help to figure it out. Luckily, with these guys, they knew that was something that they were missing. And so they weren't shy about accepting help and recognizing that, sure, we'll have to throw it all away if that's what you say we're going to have to do, and moving from there. But there are lots of organizations where they're not prepared for that. And they work with a proof of concept and they get kind of a very basic proof of concept running, and then they just build on that forever and never think about kind of what debt went into that. The stuff that you're asking about, what are the really rapid decisions we had to make? What are the really rapid tests we had to do where we had to compromise in order to find product market fit? And then understand that there are consequences for making those decisions down the road. And that, if we can't face that, then it comes back to bite us later. And often we don't know why. And we just think our developers are incompetent. They built the system with all this debt and all these problems. What's wrong with them? And it turns out it's business decisions we make along the way.
Relating to some of the investments, Richard Paris says, I would think a big issue would be difficulty getting budget for addressing org debt. Whose budget should that come out of? Which is, I think, a great and true comment.
It is. It's a really interesting comment, I think, because when we're thinking about debt, when we think about marketing, making poor decisions, who pays the price for that? What's the organization that pays the price for it? We think about sales making poor decisions. The organization pays the price for that. We think about finance making poor decisions. Again, it's the organization that pays for it. But if technology is seen to make bad decisions, you expect it to come out of the technology budget to fix it. The truth is, technology is an organizational enabler. It makes the organization go. In a lot of cases, without technology nowadays, you don't actually have a functioning organization. So you just make it part of the work, fund the teams over the long term, let them make the decisions that they actually need to make in order to do good work and continue delivering value, and worry a bit less about the individual budgets and just a bit more about ongoing delivery of value. And I think a lot of those decisions then start to be resolved.
Yeah, how I approached it as CTO was working really closely with the CFO as well. So we actually started to rework and recategorize some of the budgets. Couldn't do it all at once. We chipped away at it, made a few changes year on year, so it would continue to make things easier. So that included broader categories that more closely mapped to areas of value, so that costs such as marketing was doing some activities, but the costs for the technology they used was accounted for separately, could be addressed. Hiring more employees, but then accounting for the computers they use completely separately, so that you could have a disconnect between, all right, well, we're going to hire in this number of people, but they've all got to have really crappy machines because that's all we can afford over in this budget category over here, and starting to rejoin those connections between value and the technical investment. We achieved a lot even without making those changes. That just reduced the friction. So I wouldn't say that's a mandatory change, but I don't like having lots of my time spent having unproductive arguments. And so we made those adjustments so that the visibility was the same, whether you're the CTO, the CFO, and broadly across the organization.
I spoke with a CFO friend of mine, and your comment just reminded me of that. I spoke with him about a month ago, and we talked about if it's organizational debt, if the organization essentially decides to make compromises in the technology space in order to get something out the door or in order to achieve some goal, is there a way to articulate that in financial terms? And we thought about if there's a project, and we're talking about project land here because this is still kind of the sort of thinking that he does. But if there's a project that's, say, estimated by the team to take 6 months to get done, and it says, and as far as it's concerned, 6 months will get it done right, and the company comes back and says, we want it done in 4 months, which is, I think, a very familiar situation for a lot of us. Rather than say yes and then have technology wear the 2 months worth of problems that come at the end, think of that as a loan. The cost of that team for 2 months to finish the project is, say, at $10,000 a week for a team, is going to be about $80,000. You can put that on an internal balance sheet. You can charge interest against it, and you can accrue it over time. And you can say, actually, by not finishing the 6 months worth of work, that's cost us 80,000. And we did it in anticipation of making, say, 200 or 300 or $1 million over those 2 months. And that was why we took that shortcut. But that debt still exists, and it still accrues interest, and it's still going to take time, and it still has to be paid back. If you then don't pay that back, and you do another piece of work that uses the same software, the same work that's just been done, where you cut corners, then that interest starts to compound. And so you end up with 8% on your 8%. It multiplies over time. And by creating kind of internal balance sheets, which represent it in financial terms, you can get the attention of senior leadership, because a lot of those conversations are based around money. Whether we like it in technology or not, quite a lot of the conversations had at the senior level are based on the finances. And so as soon as you can start articulating things in terms of those finances, you can have really interesting conversations about what trade-offs you're making and how much they're costing and how much impact they're having. And then this question about paying back organizational debt and whose budget it comes out of becomes an organizational concern and not a technology concern, because I don't think it's something you can solve by yourself. It's something that you have to solve together with the rest of the senior leadership.
Yeah. So that idea of a compounding cost, we talked about communications earlier, and I like to use allegory and analogy. So I'd probably grab a clip of the Sorcerer's Apprentice section of Fantasia, as he's chopping up the broomsticks. Using things that convey an important but simple message. Comic strips. I keep a whole reserve of comic strips that talk about most of the issues and really can get the point across nice and quickly. And then make sure I create opportunities to use those in conversations before it's an issue. Okay, so we have another topic which I think might be a good lead in. So Ben Kelly says, fossilized operational and cultural practice, et cetera, can make it feel impossible to even starting addressing tech debt. Are there heuristics you use to break down where and or how to start? Short answer is yes.
Long answer is much longer, but yes.
Yeah. So I might start with an actual anecdote. So we were dealing with systems that so this was at Seek Asia, and candidates and hirers, it's a two-sided marketplace, and so we were dealing with the systems that the hirers use, so basically business to business systems, and they had been underfunded for a long period of time. They did the bare minimum, but there was all sorts of unaddressed risks and things like that. And so one of the first things we did when I joined, and we hired a few engineering managers and product managers into that area, was work with them to actually build a picture based on data, based on anecdote, based on whatever we could to understand what a situation was. And it didn't need to be a super high-tech approach initially. So for instance, we didn't have data on how much, what the availability was. So we went through the service desk data and counted up. Like, okay, every time there was a report of an outage and things like that, just put it in a spreadsheet, count it up manually. So that was at least a starting point to understand. And we worked out, you know what, we were offline, close to offline for about 16 days over the course of the previous financial year. And so by getting that data point, went, okay, well, we've got some framing, and then starting to drill down of like, oh, wow, which components were out, which pieces are offline, what did that impact, what jobs to be done did that prevent? And then we could start to build up a picture of like, well, how valuable was that for a business, and therefore where would we start? Noah, do you have a similar example or a different answer to Ben's question?
So one of them, I think I quite like your talk about kind of where the problems are happening. I like the notion of failure demand and value demand, where failure demand is defined as, well, let's start with value demand. It's much easier. Value demand is anything where a customer wants to give you money. They buy a product from you, they call you up, and they want to subscribe to your newsletter. They do something that you want them to do. Failure demand is what happens every time a customer interacts with your systems and fails to actually get the result they want. So if they couldn't sign up online and they have to call you, if you told them you'd get back to them in 24 hours and it's been 48 and you haven't gotten back and they call you, you fail to ship something on time and they cancel their order. Like, those are all examples of failure demand. And in some enterprises, it's upwards of 40% of the time that people spend is actually managing failure demand. But one of the ways that you can start kind of quantifying the debt and the problems you have is just to count it. How many interactions do you have with customers that are successful, value service, and how many are failure? And just by quantifying it and starting to pay attention to it, you start getting an idea of the patterns of your failure demand. And that often guides you to where to put your attention first. And so that then makes it much easier to justify. You've got, 40% of your time is spent dealing with failure demand, and half of that is spent on your checkout process. Okay, you now have a really clear case to go in and fix the checkout process, make it more intuitive, rewrite it, make it less buggy. Whatever the problems are, you've got really clear justification for doing it. And so that's one way I like seeing it. There's another one, which is more of a story from my experience, a bit similar to yours, where I was working at Uswitch in the UK, again, years ago, before I moved to New Zealand. And they had an existing system. And the system was fine for 360 days out of the year. Uswitch was an energy switching website. And so people would come and they would compare their energy prices to what they were paying. And if they could get a better price, they would switch. And 4 days a year, 5 days a year, energy prices would be changed and announced. So British Gas, for example, would put their prices up. And when that happened, the website would get a massive hit and often wouldn't be able to cope with the demand. And so they ran a server farm that was designed to handle all of the demand that they got. But even when they had the whole thing running, it couldn't quite keep up. And the rest of the year, they were running this massive server farm at a loss, because they probably could have gotten by on a single server at that point. But they never knew when an announcement would come, so they had to keep the whole farm running all the time. So that became the reason that when we took them over, I was working for a company that bought Uswitch. When we took them over, we decided to rewrite it. And we started with, what's the single easiest thing to slice off from the existing system? And there were two of them. The first one was importing data from the energy suppliers. So the customer never actually sees it, but actually it's critically important. And if you can understand the complexities of all the different energy suppliers and every tariff that they have and all the different ways that it works, and you can articulate it and you can write a system that works better than the old one, then you can do the rest of the system without all that much difficulty. And so that was the first step. Pick the hardest thing that's discrete and do that first. And then once we did that, the next thing we did was we looked at, what's a piece of this that we can carve off? And it turned out that Uswitch had numerous different ways that you could switch suppliers, but it had what was called an annual process, where you would bring your energy bill for the entire year. So every year, every energy supplier would send you your annual energy usage, and you could upload it to USwitch, and it would tell you whether or not you should switch plans. And that was an incredibly small, discrete piece of work. And so when it came time to actually changing things, we started there. And then we looked at, okay, what's the next thing? Well, it turns out people like switching suppliers when they move house. They're going to need a new supplier at their new house. They might as well have a look around. So the next thing we did was we did a house moving supplier. And so just thinking about things and how can we carve off this functionality into little pieces that serve the customer in ways that they don't necessarily think about most of the time. In fact, we don't necessarily think about most of the time, but are discrete and isolated from everything else. If we can just do them one at a time, we can tackle the debt in a way that's manageable and proves whether or not what we're doing works. And so we just think about what's the smallest piece of work that you can do that will demonstrate value, and do that, and then do the next one, and just keep going from there.
That really resonates, and some of the actions, in the example I was giving, that it led us to was to realize that the system would go down and take various components offline, and so we'd identified there are unnecessary dependencies, and so the smaller and more self-contained different parts of the journey, so they could be decoupled from each other, the higher the overall availability, because maybe the payments was offline, but all the other steps could be completed, and we could engage with the customers for payment later, etc. So yeah, that resonates. So we're coming up to the towards the end. Thought it might just flip through. So we talked about communication. We've talked about framing the issues with our stakeholders. We've talked about having a plan for engaging. I would use things like communication plan templates and things like that, and coach not just for me to use, but coach each of the teams to be able to use and plan their communications, so that everyone across technology and beyond we're becoming better communicators and communicating in accessible ways, and building that common understanding for where to invest. So we might now provide a wrap up and provide some takeaways, so that for CTOs and other tech leaders that are on this live stream, what's our summary of some of the key things we can do? So over to you, Noah.
So I think we talked about this last time, but your job as a CTO is not just to be active or reactive. Your job is to think. It's to understand, and it's to spend time communicating and collaborating with others so that you understand the wider organization and how everything fits together. In terms of kind of technical improvement and debt, that means kind of the first step is about understanding it. So we want to consider where that debt's coming from. Maybe it's pressure from the rest of the business. Maybe it's sales selling things that don't actually exist. Maybe it's a magpie CEO moving from one idea to another and asking for lots of different things. Whatever the cause of the debt, it falls on you as a tech leader. And your job is to figure out how you relate the decisions that are being made to the impact that they're having. The next step we want to talk about is reframe the debt. So we stop talking about it as technical debt. It doesn't belong to you. It just shows up. You're a steward or a caretaker of the systems, and you're not separate from the rest of the organization. Like the organization is a whole. And so we talk about showing the connection between the decisions and the impact that they're having, when we talk about kind of taking a loan from the future, essentially, in order to get something out the door now and trial an idea now. We talk about like the various different ways that you can talk and frame debt as the result of business decisions or just as a part of operating the business. We can talk about preventing debt. So preventing, I mentioned earlier, preventing is actually significantly easier than curing. So you encourage the teams that you are responsible for taking control of when something is considered done. Right? Technology is one of the few areas where we say it's going to take X amount of time, and then non-specialists come in and tell us actually it's going to take less. And then we go away and we figure out how to do it. And so we think about things in terms of Kent Beck's code completeness, which I mentioned earlier. We can also stop talking about speed. When we talk about speed and we push speed and everyone else pushes speed, we end up compromising quality, which then increases our debt. If instead we focus on quality, we end up getting speed as a byproduct. And then
So
the other part, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll continue. Yeah, so once you've started on that journey of tackling it, then there's how can you manage it ongoing? And so the way I would describe it is tracking it and adapting. So in the example I gave before, there was a very manual process to go and try and capture and understand what our situation is. You don't want to be in that situation. You want to understand where you're at all times and how it's changing and evolving. And so we haven't talked a lot about what we do at the technical team level, and I'm sure we'll cover that in another episode. But trying to get some of that observability and that link from what's happening from the implementation and from the running services, and linking that back to value is important. And what's also important is that you actually adapt to what you're seeing. So it's no good if you can have all this great data about the quality of your services, but then you're not using that to then make better ongoing decisions about where you invest. And then finally, as we've spent a bit of time talking today, intentionally and proactively communicating. So we are just about out of time. We had a very interesting start to the live stream, which demonstrated, some of the risk mitigation and pay-as-you-go strategies. I was going to say, where can we find you, Noah? The answer is can be by the side of the road. But seriously, do you want to share where we can find you online?
You can find me at noachcantor.com. I write about a lot of what we talk about here, and so you've got a blog that's mentioned there. I've just recently been doing a series of conversations about imposter syndrome. So if that's something that's ever affected you, then feel free to drop by and pick up the free ebook I've put together and look at the blog post that I've written. And yeah, that's me. What about you, Daniel? Where can we find you?
So you can find my blog over at this interesting URL. So the title of my blog is Great CTOs Focus on Outcomes. So I write a lot about outcome thinking and persistent models. So if you enjoyed some of the topics here, a lot of it will be relevant to that audience. So sign up. It's free. And yeah. So is there anything else we would like to share, Noah, before we sign off? And I have a new outro video just to match the intro video for when we're done.
This is a topic that Daniel and I both really enjoy helping people with. So if this is something that you're struggling with, by all means, come by either of our websites and you can sign up for a free call. I'm currently offering a 1-hour free coaching call for anyone who'd like to come by. You can find it at noachcantor.com/promo. I've got about 10 slots for these calls at the moment. So come on by, take advantage of them, and I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, and you can also find a booking link on my site. Or you can just direct message me. So yeah, I'm always keen to chat about these topics, and yeah, we can book some time in, and hopefully I can provide you some advice to get you going, and help overcome your challenges. Well, that has been another episode of CTO Lifeline. We've been your hosts, Noah Cantor and Daniel Walters. So yeah, here's my experimental tagline. We're going to keep experimenting and testing and learning with it. So the thought I'll leave you with is set a direction, sense your situation, and take the next best step. Until next time.